I can't even begin to argue the other side of this thing. There's no other side. So this was a response I had in a training I did recently, where I was asking people, take something that you're passionate about it and argue the other side. And one of the people just said, I absolutely cannot do it, can't argue the other side. And I figured, well, maybe whatever he was arguing was just so deeply personal that he couldn't even imagine another side to it. I was curious, and then we kind of pursued it, and no, it was about local mundane government issues. It really, it was like no big deal. But it was interesting because we can turn even the smallest things into like, we have to be right, and we can't even imagine the other side. It's not just the big things. And so in these trainings, what's been interesting for me is when we do that exercise, when you have to argue the other side, a lot of people just say, I won't do it. I can't do it. I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to endorse another perspective even for a second. I'm not going to platform bad ideas in my own mind. I'm just not going to do it. And this is a serious challenge for us today. In one of the trainings I was doing, and at the beginning of it, one of the people was kind of questioning whether it would even work. Like, does this model, working across divisions work? And they said, I just said, well, would you be willing to give up contempt for the other side and replace it with compassion? Would you be willing to give up contempt? And the person was very honest and paused and said, no, I won't. I cannot. There's no reasoning with them. I just hope they all die off. So we're facing a crisis right now, this time, where our ability to have curiosity and compassion for different perspectives is being lost in the fact that we're digging into contempt. We really are coming to hate one another. And today, for my message, I'm looking at Commitment 10 from this book of conscious leadership that I've been doing a sermon series from. And it argues that great leaders learn to explore the opposite of their current perspective. And I'll just read what they say. It says, I commit to seeing that the opposite of my story is true, or as truer than my original story. I recognize that I interpret the world around me, and it gives my stories meaning. So this topic is one we've certainly talked a lot about at the church. I think it's something uniquely Church of the Holy City needs to address here in Washington, D.C., where it's at its worst of the inability to see other perspectives. But it's also a tough one for our culture. We live in incredibly polarized times where it's hard to see anything good in the other side. Each side debates their side and believes it's completely right and completely good, and the other side is completely wrong and completely evil. And this leads to a polarization that we're facing that eventually spirals down. Our villains deserve only to be othered, demonized, and dehumanized if we are going to remain loyal to our team. And when we see ourselves as victims, we really don't have any bandwidth to engage in the perspectives of our villains. We just have to fight against them. We can't begin to see things from their side. So we need to remind ourselves that understanding is another perspective, it's not agreement. It doesn't mean you're platforming the other perspective. It just means that we're able to see it from their side. And that's really hard work. So to begin to see the opposite of what we believe to be true, we need to understand the difference between facts and stories. The facts are real things that exist in the world and arguable things, but we also tell stories about facts, and our stories are so common in our head that we kind of correlate them as facts. We don't even question them anymore. But here's a quick example. A fact would be that Church of the Holy City is located at 1611 16th Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. That's a fact. That's where it's located. So the story that I might want to tell about Church of the Holy City is it's a beautiful place to worship God, and that's a story that I would hold about it. But I remember the first time I visited the church in the late 1990s, and I spoke to the pastor here, and I said, this church is so beautiful, it feels so holy here. And his response sort of surprised me. He said, many people say that. I thought, okay, that's kind of an odd response. I thought he would just agree with me that it was a beautiful space. And I got curious. So what did the church mean to him? And was he implying that it's not beautiful, or what was he saying? Now, over time, I got more curious, and I got to know a couple of the different ministers here at the church. And from their perspective, Church of the Holy City was a nonstop crisis machine. It had falling staircases, molded walls, leaky ceilings, and 90% of all the church board meetings were not about the congregation, but about the building. And they would say it was very hard to minister at a church like this. So I soon learned that that was another story, that the church could be seen in sort of a negative light from their perspective. It was sort of an albatross wrapped around their neck for the work they were trying to do. So it's the same church, right? Church of the Holy City, but a different story. And both stories can be true. So learning to flip our story, whatever we hold true, is a spiritual practice. And in the gospel today, Jesus does that. He uses a very famous phrase. He says, "You have heard," and then he says, "But I say." So when he does that, he's flipping a story. You've heard this, but I'm saying this. And he's inviting other people to flip their stories. In one of his more radical pronouncements, he says, "You've heard it said that love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I'm telling you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." So he's saying, I want you to completely see the opposite of the way you've been seeing it. And now, over 2,000 years later, and millions of people who have called themselves followers of Jesus, only a handful of us really are even wrestling with this and taking it seriously, because it's very hard for us to flip the story. We might say to Jesus, yeah, that's a nice story, that's very sweet, but you're a little naive, because if you really knew my enemy's really horrible, and it's not something I'm going to flip. It's not a story I can flip, but I appreciate this sweet story you're telling. So we kind of really do enjoy, at some certain level, not just hating our enemies, but and even celebrating their downfall. And so embracing diverse people with different worldviews, different types of worship, different types of politics is a spiritual practice. And it leads to greater unity. So Swedenborg, who claims he actually went and visited heaven, has a really different view of it than almost anything I ever grew up hearing about. He said, it's a place that becomes more perfect with the more diverse perspectives it holds. Now that's a paradox. He argues that unity comes through embracing diversity in each other and ourselves, that actually God thrives on diversity. The more diverse, the better. And that radical view of heaven that Swedenborg had makes his teaching unusual, that he said all faith paths of all different people, any faith, that are seeking to do good, lead to heaven. That was a radical idea at the time. So our ability to see through the eyes of other people is an important spiritual practice. Now, most of us in our stories of our life, I'll speak for myself, we are the hero of our story, and we're fighting the villains, the people we encounter along the way who make our life difficult. When we flip our stories, we see that, sometimes we might be the villains, and maybe the person that we're demonizing is actually teaching us something. But we feel a need to label stories and lock them in, and when we do, when we lock in our stories, that leads to bias, discrimination, racism, and polarization. When we know our story is correct, and we're absolutely sure it's correct about other people, and we're not open to changing it, we're protecting our ego. The story that we're telling ourselves is we're just smarter, we care more, we've studied more, we're more logical. So we've come to this conclusion, and we're absolutely going to cling to it. And so all these are examples of where the ego wants to be right, and we cling to our stories. And now with social media, it's getting even more challenging to find different stories. A friend of mine recently looked at my social media, and he pointed out, you have a lot of things that are confirming your own opinions. like clip after clip after clip. So the algorithms begin to tell us and reinforce our views. And that makes our ability to imagine other perspectives even harder. Now, Buddhism, as a religion, has some very helpful insights here that are very complementary. It does a very good job of focusing on suffering in life, and it basically argues that suffering is created by our attachment to certain things, ideas, certain outcomes. If you give up on the attachment to the ideas, you give up on suffering. So in other words, we get attached to our stories, and those stories often lead us to anxiety, depression, and suffering. But we stick to them, refusing to see any other possible way. This was an analogy from the book on conscious leadership. It described three baseball umpires. The first one says, there are balls and strikes, and I call them as they are. The second umpire says, there are balls and strikes, and I call them as I see them. And the third umpire says, there are only pitches until I call them. The first umpire believes that he has to have a label. There's a label for everything, and it's his job to get the label right. The second one believes that things have a label, and his interpretation of the label is important. And the third doesn't think anything about the label until he assigns it one. And so the authors of the book are making a case that we need to be more like the third empire, deciding what labels we're going to put on things, because our labels carry a lot of weight. The teacher who's done the most breakthrough work on this ability to question assumptions that I've experienced is Byron Katie in a practice that she calls The Work. And it's really fun. If you want to check it out online, she does it live with people in a studio, in an audience, and it's pretty amazing. And I'm going to just briefly go over it today, but you really have to experience it. But she says basically that the secret of life is to become curious about all the possibilities. And she's boiled it down to four questions that she asks. One is, you can take, just right now, if you want in your head, take something that you're sure about, and then just ask you the first question, is your belief true? And I've discovered when doing this most times myself, and most people say, yes, I believe it's true because that's why it's something I hold on to. But the second question is, can you absolutely know that it's true? And that requires a little bit of curiosity. Absolutely know it's true. Most people who are curious are like, well, I can't be absolutely sure. And then the third question is, how do you react? And what happens when you believe that thought? And then the fourth question is, who would you be without that thought? And the exercise asks you then to give examples of the opposite perspective that you can shift to. So it's a really step-by-step exercise in how you can shift your thinking on things. So let's take an emotional issue right now that's going on, and I find very little ability to see other sides on this one. But I'm going to pick a hot-button one, the situation in Gaza. And there's many perspectives on it, but I'll just share three that I've heard that are pretty locked in. The first one is, what's happening in Gaza right now is a genocide killing 34,000 civilians. We must withhold weapons from Israel. There's simply no other way to see it. Or, Hamas started a war against Israel using terrorist tactics on civilians. They now hide behind their own people as shields. There's no way to get to peace until Hamas is completely removed by force. The loss of civilian life is Hamas' strategy. The war must continue. There's simply no other way to see it. Or, there are no good guys in this Gaza war, and they're both evil, and the best thing is just to stay out of the debate altogether. I'm checking out. So, if you will, for a minute, just privately in your own mind, let's go through this in your own head, because you probably have some opinion, maybe one of those three or a different one. But think of your view on the situation right now. So, and you can ask these four questions. Is it true, what you believe? Kind of think so. Is it possible that it isn't true? For me, I would say very possibly. What would your life be like if it were not true? Well, I'd say in my own case, I'd be more open to the other perspective. in hearing a more nuanced approach. And then give an example of what the opposite of what you currently believe. And so that's the exercise that you can work through as you're developing the skill of seeing other perspectives. I think it's the most missing skill right now in our culture, is exploring the other side and seeing whether the other side might have a more true story. One fun thing I do in the class that I teach is I ask the audience to do a fact story about me, which I've mentioned before in sermons. But the fun part is about half of the stories they tell about me are not accurate at all. And I just conclude by saying, half of the stories were accurate, half of them weren't, so question your stories, because we're all carrying them around about each other all the time. So to be curious, we have to be playful with our ideas. We need to give up the thought that we're always right about everything. And it can be helpful to seek out people who see the world differently from you and be curious with them. Be careful not to shut down people that you don't agree with, because they're listening, and as soon as they figure out, oh, I can't say what I think, they're going to shut down, and you're not going to be able to hear a different perspective. So one of the opportunities that we have, I think, at Church the Holy City, and one of the most beautiful things about churches that still remains, it's the last diverse place of different perspectives, ages, and worldviews. So we can do that here at the church. I will add, if you don't know anyone sharing any different viewpoints with you, that's a sign that you've probably made it clear to people that you're not a safe person to share with, that they are going to, that you've said something that froze them out. So instead, get curious, and you'll be surprised by the diversity of viewpoints that are around you and within yourself. So the spiritual practice of engaging and seeing the other side moves us from contempt to compassion. And now, maybe 2,000 years later, we who say we follow Jesus can begin to lead by example by actually loving and praying for our enemies. It doesn't make our enemies right. It does make us more loving. And the future of our world depends on our ability to let go of our stories and become curious to explore the opposite side. Amen.